Hello and welcome to my presentation on the High Gothic Cathedrals of the Ile-de-France. Just a note before we get started, this is future me at the moment. I'm re-recording a couple slides that PowerPoint garbled, but hopefully the change in hairstyles now and then won't be too distracting. So why are we talking about Gothic cathedrals? Well, if you walk around most American cities, you're going to walk past Gothic churches, new ones. We're still making Gothic revival churches left and right, and that suggests to me that the architecture resonates with people. The creators of the Gothic 800 years ago sought to create the kingdom of God on earth. They sought to depict and illustrate what they thought of as heaven in their architecture. And I think the lasting relevance of the style speaks to their success. Also, these original churches bring in millions of visitors every year, especially non-religious people. Just the sheer achievement and majesty of the buildings are worth looking at, and the artistic value. So there's a lot there. But that question of why they're so impactful and why we're still copying the style is the real focus of this presentation. Before we move forward, I'd like to mention in the bottom left of the slide, you'll see my personal crest. When that's there, the photo is mine. If that's missing, it's because I grabbed that photo from the internet to illustrate something that I didn't have a photo of. They were crafted with a higher purpose, and a question that really gets at the meaning that these buildings inspire in people is, who designed and built these cathedrals? And the answer is, we don't know. The creators didn't seek recognition. It was a devotional effort, and the reward that they were after was the glorification of God. Temporal reward would have diminished their effort. And related to this, one of my favorite G.K. Chesterton quotes: "Art in the Middle Ages was art for God's sake. Art in the Renaissance was art for man's sake. Art in the 19th century was art for art's sake. And now art in the 20th century is no art for God's sake." That gets to the core of why I think these cathedrals from the Middle Ages had such an impact and continue to. Also, they're Bibles in stone. They are absolutely covered in stained glass and sculpture, and the entire Bible, Old and New Testament, is depicted in that. But more than that, they're encyclopedias of the cosmos, and they're a fascinating window into the theology and philosophy of the time. So why am I talking about this? I've had a lifelong fascination with these buildings, and in recent years, that's been a deliberate study, including taking a number of courses taught by this man, Bill Cook, professor at SUNY Geneseo, who I was fortunate enough to follow around in person for 2 weeks in 2023, studying these cathedrals. My goals today are, first of all, just to share my enthusiasm. I'd also like to give you the tools to see these buildings as more than just another church. I want you to be able to look at it and see the peculiarities, the unique characteristics, and really know where to look to get more out of them. And I'd like to explain why the creators were so successful in their mission of depicting that kingdom of God on earth. What we're going to do is go over where the Gothic cathedrals came from, because they didn't spring out of nothing. What is High Gothic architecture after all? The theological and symbolic content of the structures, and the actual cathedrals, my personal experiences traveling around them. But before we start, there's just a handful of terms that we need to go over just to make sure we're on the same page. I would imagine that most of this is a review, but better safe than sorry. On the left of this image, in the center of the building, is the nave. When you walk in the west portals, that's where you are, and that's where the congregation is during services. On either side of that, you have aisles. And then crossing the nave and creating the cruciform shape is the transept. Where they intersect is the crossing, and then to the right of that is the choir, extending the nave to the apse end of the cathedral. That curved part beyond the choir is the apse, and around it the aisle becomes curved and is known as the ambulatory, with chapels connected to it. There's also a handful of terms of elevation that I'll be using, because these buildings are three-level buildings generally, with the bottom level being the aisle, or the nave, the middle being the gallery or triforium, and we'll get to why there's two terms for that, and the top being the clear story, which is a story full of just windows. Above that is the stone vaulting, held up by stone piers, and at the bottom of those piers are capitals at the top of the aisle level. And those capitals create a column. And then above the vaulting is a roof. These buildings had both wood roofs to keep the elements off and stone vaulting. Where did Gothic cathedrals come from? So let's go back to the very beginning of organized Christianity, when Christians stopped being persecuted and they started to be able to build churches for the first time in the history of the religion. They looked around at potential types of buildings and had to decide what they wanted to build. At the time, most temples were either rectangular or circular like this. Only priests were allowed inside them. The laity were confined to the porch. And this really didn't suit. The Christian God is unique. It's a monotheistic religion, and it didn't want to be confused with all of the existing religious structures. Christians also have strong guidelines in Exodus and Revelation in particular as to what a church should look like. So what they settled on is the basilica. This was a secular building used by the Roman government, consisting of a long and high nave supported by 2 rows of columns, creating an aisle on either side. And then at the far end was an apse, originally for magistrates, which was repurposed for the altar and priests. Okay, now we're getting into the fun stuff, because immediately, this is a church we're looking at right now in Rome, built in 430, and it's in very good shape. You're going to recognize a lot of things that are familiar. If you walk into an Eastern Orthodox church today, you're going to see a lot of things that look very similar to this. And when we get to the Gothic, you're going to see a lot of what we're looking at in the sculpture and stained glass. But here, we're looking at the apse end, where the walls are covered in original mosaics depicting biblical figures and stories. And so already the entire interior surface of the building is Bible teachings. Behind that later altar and painting, you would see Christ in his passion. So after the Roman Empire fell, there were 300 years where there was no large construction in Europe. It was a very violent time. But Charlemagne brought back enough stability to resume large construction projects. And when he did, they built in the Roman style. So churches from this era are called Romanesque. They're not Roman, but they're built in the Roman style. What we're looking at here is Aachen Cathedral, which is where Charlemagne had his court. And the middle octagonal tower is what remains from the very large cathedral that he built there. You'll notice the windows are very small, but certainly Romanesque does not mean small. Some of these buildings were gigantic. But for most of this time period, Christian construction was largely monastic. After Saint Benedict, monasteries proliferated throughout Europe, and this was where the intellectual lights were kept on through the early Middle Ages. Churches built in monasteries were dim, simple, private, and rural, though. So there's not a lot of ambition being expressed here. These are contemplative spaces. But through this time, the church evolved a bit. Transepts were added to create the cruciform shape. The apse that was originally just a circular protrusion was expanded with a choir and surrounded by the ambulatory and chapels. And chapels, by the way, are a place to have another altar, because you can only have one altar in a church. So if a chapel is sort of a mini attached church. And then the other big thing is, because these were monastic, the laity was separated. And so a second story was added, the gallery, where laity could enter the church and observe services without interacting with the priesthood. The narthex and screen were also added, which I'm not going to get into just for the sake of time. My favorite Romanesque example is Durham Cathedral in England. It opened in 1133, just as the Gothic was beginning, and it is proof incarnate that Romanesque does not mean small. But just look at what it takes to hold up the great weight of this stone vaulting. Monumental piers, extremely thick walls, small windows. This photo is largely artificially lit. It would not look like this if those lights were off. But despite that, it's a gorgeous space. And if you look on the outside, you'll see that it really was built like a castle. Small windows, stout walls, especially at the corners. And while it's beautiful, it feels heavy. They constructed this like it was a castle. Doesn't look that different, just a little bit more ornament, but the Gothic would change that. And that brings us to the High Middle Ages, where things start to change. Centuries of invasions end around 1000. The Huns and the Vikings and the Moors have been repressed, and some degree of stability replaces that violence. And the horse replaces the oxen as the primary beast of agriculture. And the efficiency that brought led to a massive population explosion and increasing urbanization as less of the workforce was needed in the fields. So a merchant class emerged, and everyone started to enjoy more widespread prosperity. This also meant that churches in urban settings gained importance over monastic churches. Philosophically, a lot was going on at this time also, with the rediscovery of Aristotle's philosophy around 1100 in Europe, had been known for quite a bit longer in other parts of the world. And that brought the scholastic movement. Prior to this, Plato dominated. And so a couple quick examples of Platonic versus Aristotelian philosophy. I would say the best known Platonic Christian work is St. Augustine's Confessions. It's very literary, mystical, and St. Augustine was a huge fan of Plato. He read Plato, all of Plato's works, and it was very influential on him. For Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica would be a great example, where he lists a bunch of questions, provides answers, and seeks to definitively prove through logic and reason the existence of God. Along with this, there came a new way to think. Cathedral schools form, later becoming universities, not yet, but the intellectual center moves from monasteries and the education of the nobility to these schools where people of all classes would enroll. This also meant a new way to build, that led to the Gothic, as people applied this new philosophy to architecture, and they sought to, instead of just creating a contemplative, mystical space, really depict the kingdom of heaven on this earth, a wildly different and more ambitious vision. And in this photo, I'd like to point out before we move on, in the bottom left, we have Aristotle, that little guy, and two figures above him is Cicero. You know, medieval preachers knew that even though these guys weren't Christians, if they read Cicero, for example, they would be a better preacher. I'd like to just take a look at the importance of cathedrals as well in this society. We're looking at Chartres at the moment, and you'll see that it absolutely dwarfs the town it's located in. It's dead center, and there isn't anything even remotely close to it in size and scope. It is physically and metaphorically the center for life, both intellectual and religious, for all classes. And everyone benefited from a big cathedral. It brought prestige to the town, pilgrims and trade, political and ecclesiastical authority, and local pride. People have called this era of cathedral building in France the contest of cathedrals, and there really was an element of local pride to this. And so as a result, communities came together to prioritize these structures. So what actually is Gothic? Well, it was modern in the 12th and 13th centuries. It was a pejorative coined later, and obviously Gothic is still being built today. So what is High Gothic? Well, it refers to a specific period between 1190 and 1270, when the Gothic vision was fully realized. Early experimentation is over, and while innovation and refinement does continue, the fundamentals of the style are established. So why are we looking at High Gothic if Gothic kept progressing, which it certainly did? Well, authenticity. Copies lose sight of the original purpose. Everything in these buildings had a proportion, a symbolic, practical purpose, and when you're just copying the appearance of something, you very often lose sight of that, and the item loses its impact. The whole loses its impact. So these early Gothic buildings had a comprehensive and coherent vision that later more hastily constructed buildings in the style of Gothic lacked. There's also a scale of undertaking that we're looking at here that is very unique in human history. These are multi-generational achievements constructed over 6 to 9 generations, and you really need a special environment in order for generations to work on a project that they are never going to see the completion and use of. And we already covered that a little bit. These were devotional efforts, and that provided the impetus to take on a century and a half project. So why France? The Ile-de-France was home to a unique style of art and architecture. There was only a small amount of France. That's why it's called the island of France, that was under control of the actual French king at the time. But it was the vanguard in a lot of this art and architecture. Other countries had contemporaneous Gothic styles, but the French style came first, and those other countries were derivative in a large part. The French style was exported and became foundational elsewhere. So, what makes Gothic Gothic? The pointed arch. You probably got taught this in grade school. Everybody knows it about the Gothic, but there is a large degree of truth here. It's both stylistic and structural. It replaced the rounded Roman arch, and it directed the force of whatever it's holding up much more downward and less outward, meaning higher structures and thinner supports become possible. Also, in stone vaulting, we move from a barrel vault, which is just a bunch of Roman arches lined up one next to the other, to groin vaults, where they're placed perpendicularly to each other, which means that they can take the lateral weight off of each other, and you don't need an entire wall to hold up the vaulting. You just need 4 corners. And then the ribbed vaulting, which takes the weight off of the majority of the masonry, allowing the ribs to carry the structure and the masonry just to be a more thin and lighter weight veneer. Combine this with the pointed arch and you get some pretty spectacular results. Also, at the time, the flying buttress was invented. The primary impediment to high construction is the outward force, not the downward force. And previously the solution was thicker walls. In the Gothic, they moved that support outside the building, where it was both more beautiful, of course, but also had better mechanical advantage and could be a lot thinner. The results, we're looking at Gothic Cathedral here with 162-foot vaulting, and the walls are sheets of glass. That stone ceiling, 16 stories high, is being held up just by slender stone piers, and the buttresses outside the building. And we really see the Gothic vision here of heavenly light and soaring height. One other thing I'd like to point out about Gothic construction is its sense of proportion. These buildings were planned and supervised by master builders who were often known as masters of the compass, because they built their plans with compass and ruler. And so everything was based on proportions. They gleaned those from the human body, because man was created in the image and likeness of God, so they viewed those proportions as divine. And everything, no matter how big or small, was related to the overall whole, the overall vision with these proportions. So these buildings were crafted in the same way as a photographer or a painter composes a piece of art in a lot of ways, with geometry and proportion in mind. Okay. These buildings were also packed with symbolic meaning. And this symbolic meaning was not lost on the people of the time. They were aware of this language. And so I'd like to just go over two very basic elements of this. There are many more, but it would take many college courses, I'm sure, to go over all of them, and I'm not aware of all of them. But as we continue to go through this presentation, I think you'll start to notice these elements in all of the photos we're looking at. So the first element is circles and squares. Circles are symbolic of the infinite, eternal, heavenly, and divine. There's no edges to it. It goes around infinitely. And squares are the opposite. They're symbolic of the mortal, temporal, material, human. And we experience this, four corners of the globe, many aspects of the material existence are bounded by straight edges. The example here is the curved apse opposite the rectangular nave. The apse is the holy place of the church. The nave is where the body of Christ, the literal church, the congregation, is located. But if you look at this picture, you're going to see this dichotomy elsewhere as well. The other one I'd like to mention is the vertical and horizontal. Vertical lines similarly point to heaven, and horizontal lines are bounded in this mortal plane. An example of this are the horizontal bands that interrupt the otherwise continuous piers that rise up to the vaulting. The columns and piers draw your eye heavenward, but those capitals and bands move your eye laterally down the length of the cathedral, which results in your eye being drawn to the apse. There's a few other well-known symbolic elements on these churches that I'd like to cover, gargoyles being the first. Are they a warning to sinners? Are they spiritual guardians? You'll hear a lot of different things about this. The latter interpretation has a more biblical grounding, with like the cherubim guarding the edge of the Garden of Eden, monstrous creatures. But they're far more than demons, is one point. They're on the fringe of the church, which is the proper place for strangeness, humor, ambiguity, mixed identities, and you'll find all of these things in the gargoyles. We're looking at some rather tormented souls at the moment, but you will find, for example, hilarious gargoyles, and very strange ones as well. This is the proper place for that strangeness, those literally fringe elements, the opposite of the apse and the altar and the interior. Next is the labyrinth. All of these cathedrals had a labyrinth located in the middle of the nave. They were a 15-minute walk, and they're a symbolic pilgrimage for those who couldn't visit the now occupied Jerusalem, or were too infirm to go on a pilgrimage within Europe. They were also a form of walking meditation. And the Chatra labyrinth, for example, was unveiled on Easter to allow people to walk and meditate on the death and resurrection of Christ. All right, moving on to the cathedral as a Bible. Where we will go over the theological content of these buildings. Gothic cathedrals were didactic. Most people of all classes were illiterate at the time, and to those, the cathedral was a library. It was a book they could actually read. Cathedrals were also intellectual centers focused on liberal arts, education, as well as theology. And so you'll see all of that. There were two main didactic mediums, the first being the statuary. And getting into this, you're about to see a lot of stone-colored statues, but it's important to know that that was not how these originally were. And if you go to Amiens today and go there at night, they'll actually project the original colors onto the western facade. And this is what it looked like. So medieval pilgrim or parishioner entering the church would be walking past figures and statues that looked lifelike. The portals are where the statuary is concentrated, around the entrances and exits to the cathedral on the exterior. And I'd like to just go over quickly the main program here. You had the flat tympanum above the door, where the theme of that portal is established. It is the main canvas for that entrance. Around the tympanum are the archivolts, where small figures project above you as you approach the building. And on either side of the door are jam statues, which are columnar figures related to the subject of the tympanum. Each portal had a theme. The center was almost always a Last Judgment, and you generally had a nativity and a annunciation / assumption. To the right here, we're looking at Chatra, which was built in 1150, the very, very beginning of the Gothic. And so keep that in your mind as we go next to Amiens, which is really the zenith of the High Gothic. And you can see how it's evolved. The archivolts project a great deal more. Behind the portals, there are now windows. The jam statues are much more lifelike. And other sculpture absolutely packs every available surface. I'd like to just look at this Last Judgment from Troyes very quickly to point out two things. One, this is damage from the French Revolution, not pollution, although that is a big concern now. The French revolutionaries liked to smash everything they could reach, and wherever they had a lot of power, this sort of damage and worse happened. But the other thing is you see a very graphic Last Judgment here, something that would be really surprising to a lot of modern Catholics. And there's a symbolic language here that we're not aware of anymore. It would have been less shocking to the medieval viewer. But that said, the fear of hell was probably as great as the fear of death to a contemporary parishioner. And this sort of thing was certainly on the mind of those people a lot more than it is today. But take a look at that line of damned souls waiting to be shoved into the boiling cauldron, and you'll notice a king first and a bishop directly following him. So this messaging was not targeted at the lower class alone. I'd like to zoom in quickly on jam statues. We're looking at a portal of Rennes Cathedral here, Nativity / Annunciation portal. And on the left you have Gabriel with the talking to Mary, and then on the right you have the Visitation with Mary visiting Elizabeth. And there's a couple things of note. This portal was built around 1230, and around the same time, within a couple years. But these cathedrals were works of the entire region, and so in Rennes, there were 2,300 statues. One studio was not making all of those. They were made by sculptors around the area, and there was a variety of different styles. We're looking at the progression of the Gothic style here, from the center left statue, that very simplistic depiction of Mary, who still looks a little columnar and not tremendously lifelike, to the two on the right, which really exhibit what you think of as Gothic sculpture, with an exaggerated contrapposto, known as Gothic sway, realistic drapery, hands clutching their garments and pulling it, and more realistic expressions on their faces. And then on the far left you have Gabriel, which is even more exaggerated, with a very curious and light-hearted expression on his face, and an interesting hand position. Another big concentration of statue on the western facade is the Gallery of Kings. Most of these cathedrals have a row of Old Testament kings along the top of the facade, and here at Rennes, that we're looking at right now, those kings are 15 feet tall. There's 56 of them. It extends all the way around both towers. And in the center is Clovis, the first Christian king of France, being baptized. I'd like to just go over a handful of my individual favorite statues. There is way too much to cover in the time we have, but I'd like to hit my favorites. Starting with this rhinoceros being held back by a cowering retainer on the facade of Laon Cathedral. He also has wings, so it's a winged rhinoceros. Though it may seem like a rhinoceros is out of left field, you have to remember that a lot more than theology is expressed in these sculptures. People had to learn about everything, including the liberal arts and including zoology. And so they could come to their local cathedral and see a bunch of animals that do not live in Western Europe on the side of the building. You've also perhaps noticed that we're looking at a whole lot of people in medieval garb. Everyone here, no matter what era they were from, Old Testament or New, or where in the world they were from, were depicted as medieval Western Europeans in stone castles, because that is what people knew. And my favorite example of that is here at Rennes, where Melchizedek, as a medieval priest, is offering communion to Abraham as a medieval knight in chainmail. But my favorite of all the statues is the Laon oxen. On the church tower, the western towers of Laon, there are 16 life-size oxen peering over the edges down at you, acknowledging the contribution of the beasts of burden, hauling all of the stone up a rather tall plateau to where that cathedral was built. Okay, next we will get into the stained glass, the other didactic medium. This has obviously not survived quite as well as the statuary, as it is glass, not stone, but enough of it has. It was made by cutting small colored pieces of glass into shape and fitting them together with lead, and small details were painted on top. It's actually easy to date stained glass because the older you get, the more detail was painted on. So if we look here at 15th century stained glass, just 200 years later, it looks like a painting. It doesn't look like the stained glass we were just looking at. It could be canvas. Okay, with windows, there are two main types, the oculus being the first. There wasn't really a distinction between the rose window and the oculus in each bay until relatively recently. All of these round oculus windows evolved from the oculus in Roman architecture. Think of the center of the Pantheon, for example. But they grow larger and more ornate as the Gothic progresses, and they're an easy way to date Gothic construction. I won't go into the evolution of the rose window here, but they are fun to look at. And remember, they're circular, they're symbolic of God and the infinite. Underneath the oculus are lancet windows, both the large rose windows and the oculus windows in the smaller bays. They're named because of their resemblance to the point of a lance, and this arrangement of an oculus over lancet windows becomes ubiquitous in the High Gothic. So if you want to know if something is a High Gothic, look for that. And again, thinking symbolically, this is rectangular pointing to circular. It is the material pointing upwards to the spiritual. So these were filled with educational content. How do you read them? Well, look left to right and bottom to top. So an example here from Chartres Cathedral, where the glass is best preserved, is the story of the rich man and Lazarus from Luke 16. You have the story of the rich man so far in the middle, and Lazarus on the edges. And right here, coming into view, is Lazarus begging on the doorstep of the rich man and being denied. Both of them die. The rich man is being grabbed by a demon, and Lazarus by an angel. And then at the very top you have the rich man being tormented in hell, and Lazarus sitting in the bosom of Abraham. Okay, and then just one of my absolute favorites on the south transept of Chartres is On the Shoulders of Giants. 4 Old Testament prophets with New Testament evangelists on their shoulders. I love the humility of this message. The creator's basically saying, we know more than the past prophets and philosophers because we are starting where they ended. It's a wonderful image. Okay, and now we have finally gotten to the High Gothic cathedrals. A quick tour around the Ile-de-France. Are we looking at all of them? Well, there's only 9. And we're not going to look at the 3 that are unfinished, very poorly preserved, or rebuilt, or mostly destroyed. we're going to replace those three with three early Gothic cathedrals that are critical in the development of the Gothic. We're going to mention a lot of dates, and the objective there is for you to see how quickly this style is progressing. One of the most striking things about the Gothic is just seeing, you think of the Middle Ages as a long period, but it was very dynamic, and the art and style and architecture and theology and philosophy was progressing extremely rapidly. You just have to look at the actual details to see that. Okay, so the Basilica of Saint Denis was the burial place of French kings. On the outskirts of Paris, a very important place to the French nation. And if you go here, you'll see many fascinating tombs, like Charles Martel here, Charles the Hammer, grandfather of Charlemagne, although his bones were desecrated by revolutionaries, his tomb remains at least. And here, Abbot Suger, one of the few names we know associated with the Gothic style, attempted to create, as he wrote, the kingdom of God on earth. And the only place that survives of that original construction is the ambulatory and the chapels, which we're looking at here. But this was built in 1130, and you can see, the elements of the Gothic that we've been talking about here already. Next, we have Notre Dame de Paris, and you may be wondering, why haven't we seen more pictures of this most famous cathedral so far in this presentation? Well, it's early Gothic, for one. It was started in 1160 and completed in just 50 years. And it's the least well-preserved of all of the cathedrals we're going to be talking about today. It's in Paris, so it was always the flashpoint of political unrest and the revolution, and it was damaged a good deal by natural disasters over the years, and it was also renovated quite a bit. But that said, the flying buttress was invented here, and it is a very beautiful church. But maybe even more spectacularly, and the only building that isn't a cathedral I'll be mentioning, is right down the street from Notre Dame, and that is the Saint Chapelle, the personal chapel of Saint Louis, Louis IX. And it's relatively small. It's just this one rather large and tall room, but the walls are brilliant blue and red stained glass. And if you're in Paris, it is worth the visit. And then finally, for the early Gothic, we have Notre Dame des Landes. It was started concurrently with Notre Dame in Paris, and it was completed in 1235. This is another transitional Gothic church, and very little of the innovations that were seen here are seen anywhere else. The builders here really went their own way, and that is what gives this church such character. For one, it had a bunch of towers. They planned 7, they finished 5, including a crossing tower, which is very unusual. And it has a flat east end, so 4 rose windows instead of 3. And it has a functional gallery and a decorative triforium, which gives me the opportunity to mention the gallery and the triforium. I'd mentioned that these buildings are 3-layer, and the second layer is either a gallery or a triforium. Well, the gallery was a monastic invention, really. And so with these urban churches, it was no longer really needed. You didn't need to separate the laity. it was sometimes nice to offer pilgrims a place to stay, but by and large, they could just do that on the ground floor, and so it became vestigial. There was still an area of blank wall where the roof of the aisle was until they figured out how to do flat roofs over aisles. And so it became the triforium. It retained the form of a gallery, but it was no longer a usable floor, generally just a single person passage and wall decoration. But here at Law, we have both. So you have the functional gallery underneath the decorative triforium. You also have very strong capitals on the piers, which adds to this heavily layered sense you get in Law. And in the crossing, under this unique tower, you have another triforium and another clerestory in the tower, which it's just spectacular. You'll notice that we don't have the oculus and lancet windows here. This is early Gothic. You really don't see that until the High Gothic.
Charlie, were the windows stained glass?
They were originally, and so
Okay.
all of the windows originally were stained glass. And so
Okay.
whenever you see this clear or like gray, they call it glass, those are replacements for whatever reason. And so finally at Lawn, they had 6-part vaulting. The interior stone was this gorgeous brownish tan, especially on the ribbing. And so looking up, even though you only had 80-foot vaulting, the multiple layers of strong elevation and this beautiful sexpartite vaulting was a real feast. So Law caught me by surprise, especially the cute little town on a plateau. I wasn't expecting such an impactful experience, especially from an early Gothic cathedral. Next, we have Notre Dame de Chartres. Begun in 1194, most of the structure completed by 1230, and but a lot of the exterior continued to be built for over 100 years after that. The transepts and the north and south facade in particular. And this is where the Gothic truly arrives. This is the beginning of the High Gothic. Inside, the form is very simple. You don't have side chapels. Your eye is drawn pretty much immediately without interruption down to the east end. And it was all restored recently. So you're looking at how, in the nave at least, it would have looked originally. The aisles, you can still see 8 centuries of candle soot and other grime. But how the nave looks is how it originally would have looked. And Chartres is certainly the second most famous Gothic cathedral in the world, and that is because it is the best preserved in terms of stained glass. Almost all of the original glass is intact. And as a result, you walk in and the interior is quite dim. You have to let your eyes adjust, but once it does, the windows become brilliant with all the color. Binoculars are a must. You know, each one of these windows is a story, or multiple stories. And if you bring binoculars, you can read them. Inside and out, Chartres feels very heavy. The buttresses are stocky, the windows are still relatively small. They haven't fully taken over the walls yet. But Chartres was really the model of what became the High Gothic. It was the prototype that every subsequent High Gothic cathedral in France followed. The builders of those cathedrals came here to see this one and brought back the innovations that they observed to their own projects. It was also foundational for most other Gothic styles in Europe. The exception to that is in Spain, where they really used the next cathedral as their inspiration. Bourges, built concurrently with Chartres, but with an entirely different vision in mind. If you look at this photo, you'll probably notice a couple things that look a little odd. For one, no transepts. And two, 5 portals, not 3. And so what that means is in the interior you have 2 aisles on each side and an extra wide nave and 5 levels of elevation, because you have the outside aisle and then the inside aisle has its own triforium and clerestory, and then the nave has another triforium and clerestory. Photos cannot convey this space. It is vast when you step inside in a way none of these other cathedrals were. You look to the left and right and the space just goes on. And you look down and your view isn't interrupted by transepts or anything like that. You have clear sight lines and you feel like, you're standing in an upside down football stadium or something of that nature. Already also you have buttressing that feels a bit more delicate than Chartres, and same with the piers. The building is beginning to feel a bit lighter weight. Unfortunately, Bourges is not in good condition. Almost all of the sculpture was destroyed by an invading Protestant army in the 16th century. But some original glass remains. The interior is unrestored and just feels ancient. But Bourges had an effect on people, and like Laon, it really caught people in our tour group by surprise. The unique dimensions of the space, just there isn't anything else like it. Next we have St. Peter and St. Paul in Troyes, and this is the first post-Chartres generation of High Gothic. The builders here saw what was being done in Chartres and expanded on it. But unfortunately, like Notre Dame, Troyes has not fared well with time, so we won't spend a great deal of time here ourselves. The most spectacular thing in Troyes is the glazed triforium. They flattened out that aisle roof and filled the triforium with stained glass, and so now you have 3 levels of stained glass. The aisle windows, which I'm blocking with my portrait, the triforium windows, and the clerestory. And you'll also notice that the clerestory is now totally occupying all of the space between the piers and up to the vaulting. This glass that we're looking at is original. Troyes was devastated by revolutionaries, but they didn't bring ladders. They only destroyed what they could reach, which was the first story stained glass and all of the sculpture. So Troyes didn't leave a great impact, but the town really surprised us. It is this huge medieval town, well preserved, lots of shopping and restaurants, and there's a well-marked walking path on medallions and cobblestones that you can follow around for a day, seeing this medieval town, and it really surprised us. We enjoyed the town. Next, we have Notre Dame de Rennes. And here at Rennes and the next cathedral, Amiens, are the real peak of the High Gothic. This is kind of another generation after Troyes. The structure was completed in 1275, so again, a fairly faster than average construction. And this cathedral is huge. 120-foot vaulting and 1.5 football fields long. The French kings were coronated here for 1,000 years, and so it is extremely important to the French nation. And so they had resources. This cathedral was heavily damaged in World War I, which is a story unto itself. But, and that's even more of a tragedy because this is by far the most prolific site of sculpture in these High Gothic cathedrals, 2,300 of them. But, and the style here, especially of the sculpture, really comes alive. But the French nation has done a wonderful job of restoring this cathedral since World War I. And you barely would notice that it had been pretty heavily bombarded. One thing to note as we look at the western facade here, aside from the incredible sculpture on the interior of that, which is unusual, you have glass tympanums. So instead of sculpture there, you'll see this when we look at the facade, the sculpture has been moved to the portals, the top of the archivolts, and the tympanum is all glass, leading to a spectacular facade from the interior. With the bombarding in World War I, half of the glass was destroyed. The east end still has all of its glass, and so this leads to a very peculiar, partly light and partly dark environment in the cathedral, but it is quite spectacular. And here we were able to go up into the towers, under the roof, and around the edge of the roof on the east end. We got to see all the vaulting from above. It was really spectacular. And if you are there, absolutely take the tour. We also went to Mass here. It was a Sunday, and the congregation felt tiny, despite it being a significant number of people in the space. And you've seen this cathedral coming up over and over and over again in this presentation, and there's a reason. It is really something special. Next up, we have Notre Dame de Amiens, and to me, Amiens is unsurpassed. It was started in 1220, finished in 1270, so just 50 years, and it is uniquely homogeneous. It wasn't renovated heavily later on, so what you're looking at is what was originally built in the 1200s. Looking at it from afar here, you might think, well, that looks a little small compared to what we've been seeing. It's actually 145 meters long, so just 5 meters shy of Rennes, which is the longest cathedral in France. But the difference here is the height. 142-foot vaults means that roof is just higher than we've seen, and that makes it feel a little bit of a different shape. And we've already talked about the portals. They are really the zenith of French High Gothic sculptural style and architectural style, with the windows behind the portals, and absolutely incredible statues. Rennes had 2,300, Amiens only has about 700, but Amiens is like the Chartres of sculpture. The sculpture is incredibly well preserved here. Most of it still has traces of the paint, which is why they're able to figure out what colors to project onto the facade at night. And with this being really the completion of the High Gothic, the sculptural style has reached its peak here. So we're looking here at Mary holding the baby Jesus. This is an original 800-year-old sculpture. It was moved inside just 80 years ago for preservation, and a copy replaced it on the south transept where it originally was located. And just look at that lifelike posture, that Gothic sway, the expression in Mary's face as well as her hands. This is great sculpture, and we've really come a long way from the early Gothic columnar figures we started with. Yeah, so Amiens should be at the top of the list for any visit. Tours into the towers are available, and we did go up there. The stairway to the very top is rather sketchy, but very well worth it. And go to see it at night. There's a light show, and then they show you this original color. And then finally, our last stop today is the Cathedral of St. Pierre, St. Peter, located in Beauvais. Only the apse and transepts were finished. And so what you're actually looking at here is how a cathedral would have looked when it was being constructed in the Middle Ages. They would construct it in chunk and just seal off the progressing construction with a temporary roof like this so that they could use whatever they had finished. So even though here we're looking at a Carolingian, so a 1,300-year-old nave, and only an apse and transepts completed, they were holding services in that completed High Gothic section since it was finished. The vaults here are 162 feet high, and that is too high. Like Icarus, it came crashing down twice. It was rebuilt with supports, both inside and out, in order to keep it standing. But those supports are surrounding the buttresses on the outside and only in the transepts on the inside. So inside the apse, you really get a sense of what the vision was of these creators, and it really is incredible. 162 feet stone ceilings above you with 4 layers of stained glass. It's heavenly. You can see what the architects of the Gothic were trying to portray with their vision of the kingdom of God on earth. So, thank you. I hope I've sparked an interest here. There's a bunch of additional resources that I would recommend, including Professor Cook's actual lectures. The Smart History YouTube channel is also a wonderful resource for all of these buildings. And Jonathan Pajot's YouTube channel will go over the symbolic content, both in the art and the architecture, in much greater depth than I have. But if you have any questions, I would love to answer them.
I have a couple questions, Charlie.
Go for it.
When you look at the 2 towers, like at Chartres,
Yeah.
They're asymmetrical. Is there a philosophical reason for that?
Yes. Good question. So there's both a philosophical and a practical reason for that. Philosophically, there was the idea that only God is perfect, and so these buildings, perfection was not the goal. And indeed, I mean, they were built usually over a century or a century and a quarter, sometimes much longer. And while the original architect certainly had an overall plan for the building, as the builders actually got to a particular section, they would build it in the modern style. And so you had different pieces of each of these buildings, many, not all, built in different Gothic styles, and that's what happened with Chartres. You had the northern tower being 15th century, and the southern tower being much more contemporary to most of the rest of the construction. So that was an early Gothic tower, and then the North Tower was a flamboyant Gothic tower. But my favorite example of that is it isn't always accidental. They would do this on purpose. Notre Dame in Paris has the Gallery of Kings running along the front of the western facade, like I mentioned. And they actually have one more king on the North Tower than the South Tower. There's like 8 on the South Tower and 9 on the North Tower. And the kings are all the same size. What that actually means is the North Tower is larger by an extra 2 meters or so than the South. And they did that intentionally because only God is perfect.
So, second question. I apologize, I'm not gonna be able to pronounce this one.
You're fine.
The church Amiens, or the
Amiens.
one where you had the colored
Yeah.
the light show. It looked to me like there was a more complicated system of flying buttresses on the outside. Is that true, or 'cause
Yes.
it looks very thick?
Yes, that is true. So all of like the architectural elements of these buildings progressed. And so by the time of Amiens, you had both like a more efficient. Amiens has buttresses basically going into the side of the building at 2 points, very carefully chosen. And they actually rebuilt the buttresses very quickly, like within the first couple decades, because the top ones were not providing the support they needed to. But yeah, they're a lot more delicate. They're a lot thinner. They're more complicated, and that's just the architects perfecting their craft.
Cool.
So this is one of my favorite shots.
That we're
Because it
looking at now.
shows the different areas within the cathedral, the diversity,
Yeah,
as rather than a straight on down the aisle,
yeah,
or straight on down the nave. I mean,
yeah, totally. Me too.
Hmm.
Yeah. No stained glass in Amiens, unfortunately. It was all destroyed in the Romantic period. But
but gives you a nice bright cathedral.
it does give you a very nice, bright cathedral. Yep. Any other questions?
This is just an information question.
Sure.
Are there, I know you listed sources for more information.
Yeah.
Are there any good tutorials or going over like the stained glass at Chartres so that you can see all the stories and everything?
Yeah, there's actually a book that goes through it that I'll need to look up the title of it, but I saw it a few times while I was there. Is this guide that everyone had, kind of pointing out this window is this story, and if you look
Yeah.
here, you'll see that. And I think that it's kind of like an index of all the glass, if you will,
Yeah.
and indispensable if you have the time to sit there and read it.
And if you're a tour guide.
Yeah, yeah.
And Kathy, I don't think you're going to go this far because you got the version of it just now. But Professor Cook's lectures are actually video lectures. And
Yeah.
so they're like this, you know, with images all the way, you know. Then,
So he does the stained glass too.
He does, you know, not in the detail that guide would do, but yes, he's too interested in the stained glass from my perspective.
Yeah, and for example, he does 3 lectures, like 33 or 35 minutes each, I think, on Shatra. And one of them is the building, one of them is the sculpture, and one of them is just the stained glass.
I just thought it'd be interesting because of the stories that they tell, and
It's so fascinating, and I didn't have enough time to get into it here, but
yeah,
like there's so much to the content. It's not even just all biblical. There's so much philosophy and natural science and all of this stuff.